I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate. We think too much and feel too little. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. Do not despair, the hate of men will pass, and dictators die. And the power they took from the people will return to the people. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, to do away with greed. Now let us fight to free the world, to fulfill that promise. Let us all unite.
Welcome to the show, folks. You're in the Corporation Nation with Clint Richardson. My special guest today is a gentleman named Matthew Alper. Matthew Alper is sort of infamous, if you will, for his book called The God Part of the Brain, a scientific interpretation of human spirituality. I admit I haven't read the book, but I'm thinking about it because he's got quite a following, almost like a cult following, if you will, in a good way, of course, the kind of thing that I hope to obtain, at some point, without selling the soul too much. Matthew, he attended Vassar and graduated from SUNY Stony Brook with a BA in philosophy. He's worked as a history, really interesting life, actually. He worked as a history teacher in Brooklyn Projects, a tutor in the Philippines, an electrician in England, a truck smuggler in Central Africa, and a produced screenwriter in Germany, after which he returned to New York City to write what he considers his life work, again, the God Part of the Brain, a scientific interpretation of human spirituality. Since its initial publication in 1996, his work has been praised by prominent scientists, academics, Pulitzer Prize winners. He's been cited in numerous magazines, appeared on a variety of radio and TV shows, lectured across the U.S., and be seen in the acclaimed documentary The Nature of Existence. His book is now in 7 languages. And again, it's sort of a worldwide phenomenon going on with his fan base. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Matthew.
Daniel's tomorrow. What am I doing? Matthew, my apologies. Wow. So I'm really interested in your just to start off in your history, because I know that you got into. I know that you were on a search. You were on a search to try to not to disprove, but to prove. A lot of people go on that search to try to find whether or not there is a God, if there's some way to actually, put it in the ether and actually find out. And I know that included a lot of drugs, psychedelic drugs, LSD, and that sort of thing. Why don't you tell people a little bit about your starting out with this journey?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said, it's kind of a universal search. I suppose more or less it started for me at a fairly young age, more or less when I first became aware of the concept of death. When I realized that basically everyone I know and love, my mom, my daddy, myself included, will perish for all eternity. And that concept terrified me. So, when I first asked my mom, I came running down into the kitchen screaming one night, actually, after realizing that my cat that I was petting in my bed was going to die. She reassured me with tales of all of us being reunited in some place called heaven, and that the soul will float out of our bodies. And I bought it temporarily, but I was skeptical, and it just was a question that was on my mind. As I got older and started hearing people talking about God and different religions and sort of offering solutions to this problem of what is death, and I was feeling them all out. I grew up in Brooklyn. I had friends who were Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, Hindu. And then as I got older and a little more philosophical and began studying the sciences a little more assiduously, though I was interested in science from a young age, started wondering maybe, science seems to have a lot of answers out there. Can seem to explain a lot of, and demystify a lot of the world around me. So I thought, okay, that could end up being the place to turn, but, I had no solution as of yet. And as I got a little older and started experimenting with drugs and meditation, reading books like Carlos Castaneda, people talking about transcendence, and whether it be through meditating or whether it be through ingesting these various substances as a means to transcend the physical, which again I was fascinated by the concept, because if one could transcend the physical, for me it seemed that would answer the ultimate problem of whether there's a spiritual reality, whether there is something, a soul, there's something that transcends my physical makeup, my physical body. There's some soulful, spiritual element that's a part of me. So I was really just exploring any means possible, and in the midst of experimenting with LSD, ended up having a bad LSD trip that sort of set me off course for a couple of years. And actually my sort of prequel to God Part, the book that I wrote after God Part, which is called Icarus of Brooklyn, A Spiritual Quest Gone Wrong, is really about my childhood and adolescence, and in much more thorough detail, sort of the course that led me in this particular direction. And again, then I got older and, sort of recovered from what was a very, unnerving experience. Found myself ultimately back on the quest, reading a lot of science books, feeling that was the place to turn for answers. And at about age 30, kind of just, as I guess most discoveries are made, had a eureka moment while just sort of contemplating some things. And all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I felt like I might have a viable solution to this quest I was on, this problem of spirituality and God. And the minute I conceived that idea, it came to me as the title of the book, which is The God Part of the Brain, and I wrote on a piece of paper in the middle of the night, The God Part of the Brain, and tacked it to the wall over my computer and was like, that's my next project, and began writing it. So I'm guessing the next question is going to be, what's the God part of the brain?
Well, I'm familiar with your work, and I've got to be honest, it's going to be hard to question the science, because the science is very much stuff that I'm familiar with. I think the real point is that this part of the brain is something that has been known about for, well, eons, and that it has been continuously used as a control method. Because when a man in a fish hat can convince people that he is God on earth, representing like the right-hand man of God, well, then that's going to take a little bit of knowledge, either about the pineal or of other, areas of the brain that spirituality and religious disposition come from. So, I think first and foremost, have you come to the conclusion that, like I have, that it's one of the major forces of control in this universe we call Earth here?
Well, it certainly has become a political mechanism, and this is partly, ultimately what I suggest is, and for the readers, you might be familiar with the concept, but for your listeners who maybe aren't quite so, I'll just quickly sort of go over what is the premise of this notion of a God part of the brain. But essentially I'm suggesting that in accord with the science of what's called sociobiology.
I'll tell you what, hold on to that. We're going to take our first break here. I told you they're going to come quick. Apologize for that, sociobiology. We'll be back, folks. Stay tuned.
Money and meds. We control every aspect of your life through ideological hegemony. But if you think you need guns to stop tyranny, then what you waiting for? We've already stripped you of your liberty, privacy, civil rights, and dignity. You want some more?
Worldviews, Corporation Nation. Now, Matthew, by the way, excuse me, Matthew's website is godpart.com. That's where you can find his books. And what is the website for the Icarus in New York?
Well, it's IcarusofBrooklyn.com. But if you go to godpart.com, there are links to IcarusofBrooklyn.com.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So, I was just thinking, I'm in Utah here. I used to live in New York, so I certainly recognize the accent. We have a lot of things out there that very much lend credence to all of your arguments. Not to mention the science, anyway. Not to mention the patents that are out there for mind control, which are pretty shocking when you actually find them. You have Putin announcing a couple of years ago that he would have what he refers to as a zombie gun by 2020 to control whole armies of men through frequency. You have Project Bluebeam talking about controlling the brain by forcing images and even words into the brain. I was in New York, Matthew, and I actually walked by a sign, and it was a billboard for a show about ghosts. And they had it set up to where they could actually beam the voices in your head as you walk by that sign. I don't know if you ever saw that. It was back in the 1999 or 2000, but very scary stuff when you're talking about that. We also have the organ that's in the conference center here at the Mormon Church. Mm-hmm. They have this huge organ, and it actually goes up in octaves that cannot be heard by the human ear.
I'm not really so worried about zombie guns and mass mind control. I think basically the closest thing we have to that is the internet and people basically being glued to their technology, and maybe like zombies to commercialism and materialism. Well,
I agree. I wouldn't be worried if these things all weren't patented and you could actually look them up and see for yourself. The point is, it's a manipulation of a part of the brain that seems to signify a religious belief. So when you hear that organ playing, people come out and say, wow, when that organ played, I felt God in my heart.
Right. Well, because it's an experience, and again, I'll try to break it down into the sort of the scientific mechanics of what's going on. But let me again start with, I was sort of going to use as a launching point this notion of sociobiology, maybe to clarify for some of the listeners. So essentially, sociobiology was a science founded by a man named Edward O. Wilson. He's the head of zoology at Harvard. He's considered the most prominent evolutionary theorist alive, and essentially his notion of sociobiology suggests that according to Darwinian theory, any trait that's universal to any species has a genetic component. So the fact that all cats have tails, or all certain type of bird might have a half-inch blue beak, or that humans have a nose in the middle of their face, it's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's a consequence of our genetic makeup. So any trait that's universal, it means that that's in the chromosomes of that species. What Wilson did was he applied that notion to universal behaviors. So the fact that all honeybees build hexagonal-shaped honeycombs, or beavers build dams, or cats meow, would suggest that this is not an accident either, but that somewhere in, for instance, the cat's brain, there's a very specific set of neural connections that generates meowing behaviors. We could call the meow part of its brain, which would mean that there are genes responsible for the manufacturing of that specific region in the brain. So, for instance, with humans, every human culture, no matter how isolated, has created a language. In essence, one could say humans are a linguistic animal. We are unique in that we put together combinations of sounds that symbolically represent objects, and we call that language, and that's how we communicate. The fact that every culture does it would suggest it's not an accident, but that there are parts of our brain, what we could call the language centers of the brain, which now with the help of neuroscience, we know there's the Wernicke's area, the Broca's area, the angular gyrus, damage to any one of these parts will incur specific damage to some part of your language ability to either speak, to comprehend, etc. So I applied this principle to the fact that every human culture, no matter how isolated, in the deep jungles of the Amazon to, the Aboriginal islands off the coast of Australia, every human culture has basically had a dualistic interpretation of reality, has believed in a physical and a spiritual, in essence, has believed in a spiritual realm, suggesting, if one wants to keep with the principle of sociobiology, that there must be parts of our brain that are generating these experiences, that are compelling every culture to come up with a mythology surrounded by transcendental beings, by basically a spiritual world and spiritual beings. Suggesting, again, it's not an accident. It's a manifestation of some portion of our brain that's compelling us to perceive reality with this unique bent. I then go on to suggest that the reason we would have evolved this is, one of the things that makes humans one of the most unique creatures on Earth is our capacity for self-conscious awareness. Humans are the only animal that can recognize their own reflection. Chimps can be taught to, but inherently we're the only animals that use mirrors as a tool. With self-conscious awareness, we became the most powerful species on Earth because it enabled us the capacity for self-modification. So, for instance, if, let's say, the Earth's axis shifts and we get hit with another ice age, rather than have to passively wait like every other creature on Earth to slowly evolve, let's say, a thicker coat of fur, we can say, I am cold, and within an hour, we can sew ourselves a coat of fur. So basically, we don't have to wait for natural selection to happen anymore. We've actually, with the capacity for self-conscious awareness, we've superseded natural selection. We can change our environment to suit us no matter where we are, to the extent that, like, we can live out in space or under the seas. However, the drawback was that in becoming aware of the fact that we exist, little minor glitch in the system, we became the first animal to become cognizant of our own demise, of death. We became the first existential creature, basically suffering a constant anxiety crisis at the threat of imminent death. So what I suggest happened is, as a result of this debilitating anxiety that could have crippled our species as a result of self-conscious awareness, I'm suggesting that nature selected a cognitive adaptation. Basically, our brains evolved so that we were now compelled to have this concept, this perception built into us that there's a spiritual reality and that we're part of it. So, essentially, we no longer fear death because we feel that we're immortal. We feel that there's some part of us, this spirit, that will exist, that will transcend death. So it's a coping mechanism. It's an evolutionary adaptation that made us basically a more survivable organism in light of our unique awareness of death.
And of course, we have to adapt to our own sort of mistakes with that as we more and more pollute and do things. Because, the drawback to that is, of course, when you have someone that's very much into the fact that they're going to live after this particular life, and they're the ones that are supposedly the caretakers of the planet or government, well, then you've got a little bit of a problem there. That's probably the last person that should be in a position of taking care of the earth around us. It's certainly a double-edged sword. And, of course, now we have the transhuman movement and all of this stuff going on. So, very, very, very interesting. The God part of the brain, a scientific interpretation of human spirituality. And again, that's godpart.com. My guest today, Matthew Alper.
So, I don't know, is there any aspect of the theory that you might like to approach, or...
Well, yeah, when we get back, we're going to go on break here in 2 seconds.
Okay.
I guess I just timed it wrong. You actually listed, besides the part that you just listed, you actually had 3 other parts to that theory that I'd like to go over. We'll be back, folks. Stay with us.
Don't have enough to eat. Show the children shoes on their feet. How's the people living in the street? Oh, there's a solution.
Folks, welcome back. We're the Corporation Nation. My guest today, Matthew Alper from godpart.com. We're talking about the book, The God Part of the Brain. We just talked about the sociobiological aspect of what it might be that's causing, religiosity, I guess. If the tenet for, on a bell curve, for a lot of people to be for a few people to be very, very religious, a lot of them to be, sort of somewhere in the middle, and another very few to be completely anti or atheist or just don't give a darn whatsoever. So, which is a typical in most scientific research. You always have that bell curve. But I wanted to ask, that doesn't necessarily, when you say the term evolution, gets people riled up, right? Evolution. Of course, it doesn't mean what a lot of people, the arguments between the religions and the scientists are often so one-sided or two-sided that they never meet a middle ground. So what we're talking about really is the evolution of the social behavior of mankind as opposed to your actual changing over the years.
Well, when I'm talking about what aspect of evolution, I mean I believe in evolutionary theory,
right.
And what I suggest is that it was part of the evolution of the hominid lines, which is the last 12 million years of humans in like sort of proto-human form. It took 12 million years to go from something called prosimian, which was a primate, and basically over the course of 12 million years floating around the plains of Africa, going through these various evolutions, these incarnations from Ramapithecus to Australopithecus to Homo erectus, etc. So there was these transitional creatures, but it wasn't until the evolution of Homo sapien, our species, about 100,000 years ago, that humans had evolved, or that life had evolved, or in this case primates had evolved what we would call religious or spiritual consciousness. So I'm suggesting that it was a hard evolution, not just a cultural evolution. Cultural evolutions might determine what types of religions come and go.
Mm-hmm.
But biological evolution is what determined that there would be actual parts of our neuroprocessing that would compel us to have these particular perceptions, just like it was a part of our physical evolution that gave us linguistic consciousness. If we go back to any prior creature to man, no other animal speaks a language. They use sounds to communicate. I mean, even birds chirp, but no other animal puts together combinations of sounds that, again, represent objects, so that I can say the word dog and it summons in your mind a furry creature. So only humans can do that, meaning it was during the last stages of hominid evolution that we literally, biologically, our genes changed and our physiologies changed so that we now had this new capacity.
Well, let me ask you this, just to throw this in there. Right now we're seeing such advances in science. A lot of people would tend to believe in the mythologies of, say Atlantis or other advanced cultures on the Earth. We certainly have archaeological ruins that suggest there might have been something going on. Is it possible, in your theory, or is there room for it, that what we're doing now by genetically creating and altering the species of both food and animals kingdom, bug kingdom, is it possible that well, creationism is much more scientific than. In other words, could we have created ourselves at some point? Could we be a product of science, considering that we all, every single thing on the earth seems to have the same DNA structure, and it's just turned on and off depending on what you are. But if you're a nematode worm, you have a much more advanced DNA than the human. So,
well,
is there room for that?
That's really true. I mean, first of all, it depends what you mean by advanced, but we are more sophisticated, and in the evolutionary tree, on the timeline of evolution, we're a more advanced creature than the ringworm. So, or whichever worm you just referred to, any of the worm family. So, words like more advanced, those are subjective terms, so I don't know what you mean when you say advanced, but
they have more DNA, although it's turned off is the point, actually. But all the DNA that is found throughout the animal kingdom.
Well, it's not necessarily no. I mean, our DNA is different from the rest of the animal kingdom. A cat's DNA is different from humans, which is why we don't have a tail.
Thanks to the epigenome, and some people are born with a tail. That's not really the point. The point is, and the question is, do you not think that considering science of today, which has been warped into something, to me, that is pretty horrific, actually, considering cloning and everything else?
Again, those are all. See, again, those are judgments, whether cloning is good or bad. I mean, first of all, no one's cloning humans yet, and even though it probably could be done, and it's possible that it is being done somewhere in China or who knows where, but
it's not a judgment. I'm actually asking you a question with supporting evidence.
Right, but they're asking me what's the question?
Is it possible that back then we were created by some other, or possibly ourselves? Did we mess with science back then, like we're messing with it today, to create new species? I mean, I can refer you to all the species that they're patenting. 40% of your genes in your body are now patented.
Well, no, I do not believe in any type of conspiratorial notion that, for instance, there was some advanced society in the interim of man that created gene therapies and changed who we are, so that we're actually not the original Homo sapiens that came from the plains of Africa. Essentially, I think most scientific theory, genetic theory, agrees that, whether it's dating back to something like mitochondrial Eve, that's our sort of coordinated ancestor that we all have, not the scientists of Atlantis who grew us out of a petri dish. I would tend not to buy that notion over the more mainstream genetic science concepts of just essentially the evolution of the human species.
Okay. Well, it's good to know. It's good to know where you stand on such things. What other evidence? I know you have a list of several key features of this. What other evidence do you have?
Well, like I said, the sociobiological argument was the first clue for me. The mere universality of religious belief led me to, to presume that it's very likely that we're genetically predisposed. There are parts of the brain that generate these perceptions, but that's still theory. So I then had to dig deeper, and I started looking around to see, was there any science out there that might be supporting what I am suggesting? And I found in a number of areas, the first I will go into, which is the neurophysiological, in which case there's been a lot of scientific research being done, including such as, for instance, brain scans, MRIs that have been done on both monks meditating as well as nuns and other religious groups praying, and putting these people in MRIs and seeing, is there anything that happens in the brain? And basically what they're finding is that regardless of what God you pray to or what religion you believe in, if you meditate or pray, the same thing is happening in the brain, and it's very specific things that are going on. which would make sense because the descriptors of a spiritual or mystical experience are pretty much the same regardless of what religion you believe in. So whether you're meditating or praying, and again, regardless of what your God is, when you pray, people generally describe a sense of tranquility, of euphoria, which now we know the same thing with meditation. You meditate and you'll have a feeling, or be overwhelmed with a feeling of tranquility and bliss. This can now be attributed to the fact that we now know that if you meditate or pray, your brain's amygdala, which is part of the limbic system, where a lot of the emotional centers of the brain, and essentially your amygdala gets a decreased blood flow. The amygdala is where fear and anxiety is generated. So if you meditate or pray, you cut off the blood supply to it, and your normal fears and anxieties are dissipated. We're overwhelmed with a sense of euphoria.
All right. Hold that thought. We'll be right back, folks. Stay tuned.
Hi, neighbor. Welcome again to this neighborhood. I'd like to show you something. You know what this is? Maybe if I press this button. Imagine every person that you see is somewhat different from every other person in the world. Some can do some things.
So Matthew, why don't you explain what the amygdala I can't say it. I'm sorry. I'm recovering from some stuff, and I'm on some drugs that are making me kind of loopy, so my apologies. But
what's a pretty loopy word?
Explain how that works in the brain.
It's actually, I think, Latin for almond, because it's almond-shaped, the amygdala. So explain how what works.
Well, what it does in the body, so that
right. Well, it's a part of the brain that basically governs fear and anxiety in the brain. So when you're experiencing anxiety, your amygdala is at work. If you meditate or pray, your amygdala gets a decreased blood flow. So your normal sense of fear and anxiety is washed away, and we describe it as feeling a sense of euphoria, of bliss, of tranquility. That's why when we meditate or pray, it induces that experience. Again, if we meditate or pray, one of the descriptors is that people describe a loss of normal ego boundaries, a loss of feeling of self, a feeling of connected to a higher power, of what is sometimes described as God consciousness. This can be attributed to the fact that the right frontal lobe, where essentially identity is generated, also gets a decreased blood flow. So our normal sense of self, our normal boundaries and sense of identity is also sort of fades, and we feel this sense of sort of oneness. Another descriptor is that our sense of time, and so people say we feel a sense of timelessness and spacelessness. Your brain's parietal lobe also gets a decreased blood flow. The parietal lobe governs temporal and spatial consciousness. So all of a sudden our normal sense of time and space goes away, and we feel kind of this ethereal sense of being lost in this oneness, this timeless, spaceless place. Again, all sort of leading us to believe that we've made contact with some type of other realm, when in fact all that's happening is the brain is sort of doing, is processing in a particular type of way that's convincing us that we're having an experience that transcends the physical realm. Then there are experiments being done. There's a guy, Dr. Ramachandran at UC San Diego, who specializes in epilepsy, but particularly in something called temporal lobe epilepsy. And what he found was that a lot of his temporal lobe epileptics, a lot of his patients were describing, particularly they have this type of epilepsy, that these people had like a 25% chance of being very religious, and that they described their seizures as a religious experience. What he found was with these people, for instance, whereas maybe a flashing light can generate an epileptic seizure for some people, can trigger it, for these particular temporal lobe epileptics, if you show them like a religious icon or even read them a passage from their Bible, regardless of what that Bible is, they can have a seizure. It can offset a seizure. So essentially, he began to conclude that perhaps the temporal lobe was somehow connected with religious consciousness, with this sensibility of being religious. Then you've got other doctors who did experiments with, or research rather, on what's called organic psycho syndrome, essentially people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries. So what they found is that there is a number of people who have been basically banged in the head, and it can affect them in one of two ways. In some cases, these people have been completely non-religious and suddenly got banged in the head and literally found God. Suddenly, they were like, experience a religious conversion. All they could think about and talk about was God, God, God. Then in other cases, people who were extremely religious and got knocked in the head and went the other way suddenly reported like not caring about religion, no longer felt the need to go to church, again suggesting that these are brain states, that all of these notions, this sensibility of believing in a higher power is being generated in the brain. The next place that I began to look was in genetic studies. Particularly, there was a advanced study done at the University of Minnesota with 30,000 pairs of identical twins, both fraternal and identical and non-identical twins. And what they found was, particularly in twins separated at birth, that if you separated identical twins at birth and then later on found that one reported that he was, let's say, highly religious, that there was a 50% likelihood that his identical twin would be highly religious as compared to the same study done with a non-identical twin, with just a fraternal twin. Again, suggesting that this sensibility is inherited, that we're born with this sense to believe in something, to go to church, some of us more so than others, which is sort of what you were alluding to earlier when you were talking about the bell curve, which is another facet of the theory that I go into, particularly in light of when... Yes?
Would you say it's actually the urge to go to church or the urge to have some form of spiritual camaraderie-ship? Because church is a concept created by, of course, man. So I don't think it's right to say church, but to have church
doesn't necessarily mean like a Christian church. I mean, church can, anthropologically, church can also just be referred to as a site of worship. You know, these words are interchangeable. I don't mean necessarily church.
You're saying that scientifically it has to do with a specific location, or just the urge?
A specific location. No, that they are. Well, if you look at every culture, there are shrines. There are specific locations that are allotted as basically sacred sites. Every culture has the notion of sacred, and every culture has had sacred sites. Every culture has had a sacred class, basically a priesthood or a shamanship, a group of people who are believed to be the intermediaries between the spiritual and the physical realm. Every culture has had sites of worship, literal sites, shrines, where people got together and huddled in a circle or looked up to the sun or the stars and prayed at that particular site for whatever ritualistic purpose. Now, based on all the evidence that's out there, I've tended to split this instinct into two separate parts. So I believe that there's the spiritual instinct and the religious instinct, and these are basically separate. They can be combined, but they don't have to be. So, for instance, the spiritual instinct is involved more in an experience, the sense that we describe when we say a feeling of God consciousness. I felt connected to the world, to the universe as a whole. I felt a loss of my normal sense of self. I felt at peace. I felt tranquility. That's an experience we have, and it makes us feel connected to some type of higher realm. The other aspect to the experience is religiosity, the religious instinct, which is not about the experience of feeling God. It's more about the ritual and the notions of worship, of basically being part of a religion, part of a church, of the notion of a group. And what that does is it basically fosters the group dynamic. It gives us a sense of purpose. It gives us a sense of meaning. It gives us ritual.
Doesn't that go back to the urge to be in a clan or a tribe? I mean, is that necessarily a church-going type of thing? After all, churches were, for many, many centuries, were the actual government. I mean, the colonies of America were all congregational churches, and that's what government basically was. So you still had the mayor of the town and you had the church. But yes, they were called theocracies at the time because often the priest ran the society. But that now you're just talking about like nitpicking over the politics of it. I'm not, though, because the point I'm trying to make is this is a chicken or the egg type of question. How could how could these shrines or the building or this particular area be ingrained into the brain if those shrines and special areas are created by that priest class? I guess that's the question. That sounds a bit fallacious to say that you're pre-programmed to go to a certain spot on Earth and worship.
No. You're not pre-programmed. Obviously, someone picked the spot. The books of the various world mythologies and Bibles of the world didn't hatch out of nowhere. People wrote them. All of the tales are man-made.
Sure, but that doesn't explain. We'll get into this when we get back, because that again, it's putting the chicken before the egg kind of thing. How could people be attracted to a certain spot? Of course, unless there is a scientific explanation for that. We'll be back. We'll discuss this more. Thank you. Stay tuned.
Don't give yourselves to brutes, men who despise you, enslave you, tell you what to do, what to think, and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machines, you are men. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful. Let us use the power to make this life a wonderful adventure. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world to do away with greed. A world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Do not despair. The hate of men will pass and dictators die. And the power they took from the people will return to the people. Let us all unite.
Welcome, folks, to the Corporation Nation radio program. My guest today is Matthew Alper from godpart.com. And the book we're discussing today is The God Part of the Brain, a scientific interpretation of human spirituality. We're also talking, which is actually a very interesting idea you had, about the follow-up book to that, which is sort of how you came to all of these conclusions. And I will certainly give you due diligence that you've certainly done your research, and I commend you on that. It's a very powerful argument. Just to be clear on what we were discussing before, now I can understand where there's a part in the brain, the amygdala, which triggers the flight or flight response in I can't remember, with hippocampus, I think it is, and all of that. But what I can understand is there's one of my problems that I have when I listen to arguments between what I call the left and the right. It's the same paradigm in politics and religion. Is that the church is somehow, conclusive evidence because the church is corrupt, the Bible is corrupt. Because this is one way.
When I use the word church, I look at it as, again, from an anthropologist perspective. I don't care about any one religion. Church is just used as a term for a place of worship. I'm not talking about the Catholic Church or any particular church, any one church or sect of church, just the capacity for man to be compelled to create sites of worship. That's
so
all.
would you consider then, if I were to seek out the most beautiful waterfall in the world that I can find anyway, and that's where I wish to meditate or pray, that would be a place that you're talking about? Because otherwise it's a man-made place, and that can't be part of the brain.
No, of course not. No, men pick sacred shrines. So, for instance, like, the Kaaba stone that all Muslims have, are supposed to do, what's the word? Their pilgrimage to Mecca is to see basically a rock. It's called the Kaaba stone, and it's a black rock. It's a meteorite, and it fell to Earth, and they probably thought it was some kind of, came from heaven, that God threw the rock, hurled the rock down, and it became a holy stone in pre-Mohammedan times. And when Muhammad came up with this notion of a new religion of Islam, he basically assimilated the Kaaba stone as a sacred shrine, and it was considered now like this place of pilgrimage, and because it's black, they believe that if you touch it, it absorbs all of your sins. That's why it's black. And therefore you become absolved of your sins because you made this pilgrimage. And most cultures have some form of the same, a pilgrimage, where you can cleanse by going to this sacred spot. Now, of course, where the Kaaba stone was placed is man-made. The fact that someone said, let's pick this particular rock and call it a sacred shrine is man-made. I'm not saying that we're born with sacred shrines in our head. We're just born with the capacity to believe that a spot or a site can be sacred. And every culture allocates various spots in their community as sacred spots where people have to go to pray, either for the burial of our dead, our sacred shrines.
It's basically a communal chemical response in most men.
Exactly.
Some
Correct.
men seem to be immune from it.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, basic science. That's perfectly reasonable. So, is there anything else to the genetic aspect of this?
There hasn't been. I mean, that's probably going to be the last part that'll be cracked. First, they have to really find exactly where in the brain, and they're getting closer, and it's a combination of parts that gives us this sensibility that there's a higher power. It basically overlaps with our linguistic capacities, our musical capacities. Every part of us, our emotional parts, are all intertwined with our sense of belief in a transcendental reality. And then the next part will be trying to locate which genes are responsible for making those parts of the brain or those connections in the brain. But for now, the closest that they've come to any kind of genetic research has been with, like I said, identical versus fraternal twin studies, showing. And then the other argument that I go to as support of this idea is the fact is basically what I call the entheological argument. And entheogens are a series of substances that botanists have classified as basically inducing some type of mystical experience. So, and cultures from all throughout history have used these entheogens, these religious-inducing substances, as part of religious ritual. So whether it be the peyote used as by the Aztecs, which they called the flesh of the gods, and they used to eat it pre-religious ceremony to induce these experiences, to iboga eaten by the Africans, to cannabis smoked by the Scythians, to any number of substances used by different cultures as part of their religious ritual.
They all seem to have similar visions, right?
They have similar visions, and it's a similar chemistry. That basically the molecular chemistry underlying, they basically hit the serotonin receptors. So the fact that these various plants can trigger a religious experience would suggest that the experiences themselves are chemical, that essentially these plants we're ingesting, just like when we drink alcohol, it affects our brain in a specific way. These specific plants affect us in a way that it induces this type of experience, suggesting that the experience, again, is chemical in nature as opposed to some actual contact with some ethereal transcendental realm.
Now, is there a similar explanation to the seemingly similar reports that what do we call those, near-death experiences where people seem to see the same thing? Is that a chemical reaction in the brain? What is that?
Yes. I have chapters that pretty much cover everything that we're discussing is basically covered in some various chapter in my book, The God Part of the Brain. But yes, there's a chapter called Near-Death Experiences, and the one I talk about entheogens is called Drug-Induced God. But there's also a chapter on near-death experiences, and I talk about the universality, the fact that every culture has experienced these, described them with the same symptoms, and essentially now they know the neurochemistry involved. And essentially, when you're losing oxygen, when let's say you have a heart attack, you're in an accident, you're bleeding to death, when your brain starts getting reduced levels of oxygen, it basically triggers the release of a neurotransmitter called glutamate. And what glutamate does is glutamate essentially triggers near-death experiences. And now they've, replicated this in laboratories, finding that essentially you can have a chemically induced near-death experience by manipulating the brain chemistry in the same way. So, for instance, the white light that all people claim to see, they now know that when glutamate is released into the brain, the optic nerve flares. So basically, even though our eyes are closed, we see this intense white light. That's what we experience. Then the temporal lobe becomes stimulated, and from what I was telling you earlier about temporal lobe epilepsy...
Hey, Matthew, hold that thought. We're just going to go to a quick break. Stay tuned, folks.
It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water, like water. Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. Running water never goes stale, so you gotta just keep on flowing, so you gotta just keep on, Under the sky, under the heaven.
Welcome back to Corporation Nation. My guest today, Matthew Alper, godpart.com. Please continue, sir, with you were saying about temporal epilepsy and the fact that the brain convulsing like that or whatever happens in an epileptic seizure induces...
Well, we were talking about near-death experiences, and I was saying that they find that, basically the temporal lobe is one of the things that's stimulated during that experience, and from that same research done by Dr. Ramachandran on the temporal lobe, it's no wonder that part of a near-death experience is also a religious experience. And again, regardless of what religion you believe in, you will come out of these experiences swearing up and down that you felt the presence of be it Jesus or Allah or Zeus or whatever religion it is or God you pray to. So again, more sort of evidence to support the notion that all of our beliefs, all of these sensations we have and these experiences that we have that we are so convinced are real are really just tricks being played on us by our brain, tricks that compel us to believe in a other realm as a coping mechanism that basically was installed in us to compel us to survive our unique awareness of death, or to enable us to survive our unique awareness of death. So again, it's just all part of a very sophisticated neuromechanical complex in the brain that processes our thoughts in a specific way that makes us believe. And yes, near-death experiences are part of that.
So there again, I guess the devil's advocate question to ask here from the other side would be, well, if it's so specifically programmed, who was the programmer? How did this happen?
Sure. Well, I mean, unless you unless one is willing to accept the concept, the precept of evolutionary theory, which basically suggests that there is no overseer, there is no God, there is no, watchmaker in the sky that basically made humans, you could ask that about any part of us. You could say, well, where did hands come from? Where did ears come from? Where did hearing come from? And again, as someone who's a proponent of evolutionary theory, I would suggest that, again, throughout the evolution of life over the course of the last 3.2 billion years, these are all things that evolved in us. So just like our language parts evolved in us, a scientist wouldn't say, well, who put it there? They'd say, well, evolution put it there. It was part of the process of the nature of things. The same thing is true of the parts of the brain that compel us to believe in a God.
Well, there again, this is going back to the paradigm that there's only two choices, evolution and God, which is a little disturbing to think that those are the only two choices we have.
Well, what would be another choice? Give me an instance.
I mean, I'm open-minded is the point.
Okay, but what would be, like, are we talking about the Atlanteans growing us in a petri dish? Is that what you're talking about as another possible explanation?
I'm referring to the fact that they're growing brain cells on computer chips today and programming those brain cells to do specific things. So I'm talking about, again, the possibility that there is a sense of design going on, but it's neither. I'm just saying it's a possibility, and the fact that you're not open-minded to anything but this.
In this regard, I am not open to anything other than evolutionary theory as the explanation, interpretation of human life or all organic life. Now, it might be easy to sort of shun in theory, but all of our medicine, when you go to the hospital and let's say you need, be it a heart transplant or any type of, operation, all of biological science, all of medical science, which is based on biological science, comes through evolutionary theory, is under the presumption that these organs evolved so we can connect the dots and see why, an orangutan heart might fit into a human heart and work for the same reason, because it's all based, all of the genetic therapies. You might talk about complaining that we have sort of genetically grown strawberries. Nevertheless, they work. They work because it's science.
Well, it's interesting because iatrogenic medicine accidents, if you will, are the number 3 cause of death among Americans. That means doctor.
Well, look, how people abuse the medications they take is not that doesn't in any way compromise the nature of science. Science is based on theory. If you can have a charlatan come out in any science and prescribe poison and say, look, he has a doctor's license, he prescribed poison, see, science doesn't work. And it's like, no, that's just a greedy nut.
No, it's not that science doesn't work. It's that science has been turned from science into basically a giant corporate structure that really has nothing to do with science. Science is supposed to be discovering nature and how it works. That's not what they're doing anymore. Like you said,
No, that's not true. First of all, science there's a million sciences. There's botanical science, there's anthropological science, there's physics, there's biology, there's genetic science.
Then what the heck do you call mainstream? Isn't that what you use, the term mainstream? Science?
Do I believe that all science has been abused by some type of mainstream policy? No. Science is constantly advancing, which is why human longevity keeps increasing.
You're talking about science the same way I would talk about religion. You're talking about it as a thing and not a set of features that is used to discover.
What it is it's a method. Science is simply one thing. It's a method, the scientific method. It's a process by which we gather a few facts, use deduction, and make new facts. And that's science. It's basically the evolution of technologies. Electricity, for instance, came out of science. It didn't come out of the church. It didn't come out of shamans praying or waving their magic sticks in the sky. It came through a very specific process, a method by which scientists kept using what information they had to deduce new information to advance new technologies. So now we have the electric light. So, and that's all it is. How, then let's say you have a company like General Electric come and they start selling light bulbs. And now let's say they get a monopoly and now they're robbing everyone blind for the use of electricity. That has nothing to do with science. The politics and the policy by which science is utilized, sold, all of the above is not a slant on science. It might be a slant on the greed of scientists or, let's say, medical practitioners maybe who are signing out, prescription drugs like candy, but that's not science. That has nothing to do with science. That has to do with just the abuse of the medical community, which is just the abuse
it has nothing to do with medicine either. That's the point. Medicine is controlled by the American Medical Association.
Well, it does have to do with medicine because if most of the time, if those pills that are prescribed are used properly, people will live longer. They will either cure your cancer or help you maintain your diabetes. You take away insulin from a diabetic and they'll be dead in a day. So that medicine helped them. Now, if that diabetic is abusing their insulin levels to get high or whatever one might do as an abuse of their prescription, that's a personal choice. But again, you can't cast a huge net on science and say science is corrupt or science is being abused or science is just wrong.
Well, you've done so with religion. You've cast a giant net on it, and I don't disagree with you. So why can't I cast a giant net and say everything's really wrong right now? We'll be back, folks. Stay tuned.
And the men who hold high places must be the ones who start to mold a new reality closer to the heart, closer to the heart. Blacksmith and the artist.
All right, folks. Welcome back. Again, my guest today is Matthew Alper from godpart.com. I want to read a little section from the website. This is actually from the Icarus website. Well, I mean, it basically says that your chief aim was to acquire knowledge of God in your youth. This is a pretty lofty and, worthy cause, of course. Thus begins the personal journey that is Icarus of Brooklyn, the spiritual quest gone wrong. And you go into your experiments with drugs. And it was from early childhood, Matthew devotes himself to the investigation of all things magical, mystical, and philosophical in search of the ultimate meaning. Only Matthew is no Buddha, the product of Jewish Bohemian Brooklynites. Matthew is impish and irreverent, evolving from a hopeful innocent to a skeptical adolescent. He begins experimenting with psychedelic drugs to hasten his quest for transcendence, only to have a bad LSD trip that precipitates a tragic descent into madness, attempted suicide, and hospitalization. Referring to the Greek tale of Icarus, a story of a man who will stop at nothing to gain a glimpse into the heavens, only to be burned for his hubris and wanton recklessness. So, a couple questions on this. Now, you are, I guess the proper word is declared atheist, is that correct?
Yes.
What does that mean to you? Is there an official definition, or is this personal?
I would say that there are various definitions because I've spoken to different people who consider themselves atheists and think of it as meaning different things. For me, it means someone who essentially does not believe in a spiritual reality of any kind. So I've known people who are like, no, I'm an atheist. Like, I don't believe in any religion. I think religion is stupid and it's all political and it's, used to manipulate people. But I believe that there's a soul and that we're all connected to something greater. To me, that's not an atheist. That's a spiritualist. That's someone who maybe has, denied religion, but they still believe that there's a spiritual reality out there my notion of atheist is pretty hardcore, which basically there is no spiritual realm, period. There's no soul, there's no spirit, there's no God, there's no afterlife, there's no ghost. There's nothing that we would say, again, supersedes the purely physical realm. It's all molecules and atoms. And we're just wind-up toys in space.
The question I guess I have is, does that mean that you really could never even entertain the thought? In other words, you've developed almost a religion yourself by saying it cannot exist by information?
I don't think believing in what I consider to be a fact makes it a religion. So if you ask me, if we look up at the sky and you say, what color is it? And let's say it's pretty clearly blue that day, and I say, I don't know, I'd say the sky is blue. You could say, well, could it be orange? I say, nope. Could it be green? Nope, it's blue. You could say, you know what, you're almost like a religious person. Like, you refuse to accept the fact that it might be other colors. And in my spectrum, I will stick to the fact that I consider it blue. So my disbelief doesn't necessarily represent a religion. It means it represents the lack thereof. By denying someone else's fairy tale doesn't create a religion. So you could say, well, do you believe in Zeus? I could say, no, I don't. You could say, oh, that's a religion, not believing in Zeus. Do you believe
that's fallacy.
Do you believe in Allah? No, I don't. Oh, that's another religion, the religion of people who don't believe in Allah. And you could go through every god.
Big difference here. I'm asking you, would you entertain the belief in something if it was presented to you as fact?
Oh, if anything's presented to me as fact, I mean, I've said numerous times that, first of all, I went into all of this hoping that there was going to be magic in the world. I was hoping I'd be able to fly and live forever and all of the above. It just turned out that my research led to an opposite conclusion. But if someone presented me with what I felt was conclusive evidence that there was a spiritual reality in whatever form it would take, I will lead the bonfire and I will personally refund everyone who ever bought a copy of the God part of their brain and shake their hand gratefully as I take their book and throw it into the bonfire after I refund them. I would look forward to that day, because that day would mean that was the day that I realized that I was wrong all this time and that I'm actually immortal. I mean, I certainly wouldn't choose death in the next 20 or 30 odd years over eternal life. You know, I'm not in any rush to take a dirt nap. So it's not like I'm happy about my solution. It's just what I've found that within, with the evidence provided to me, that it seems to be a pretty sound fact. Let me ask
you another question. Now, it says you were the product, in other words, you were the son.
Yes.
Of, what was the word? Jewish Bohemian Brooklynites. I assume that was, actually, I'm sorry, if you don't mind me asking, what year were you born?
1964.
64, right in the thick of it, huh? So, now there's certain studies that have been done that do you identify as Jewish?
The best I could do is call myself an atheist Jew. So perhaps culturally, I mean, I'm sure that, be it anything from a part of my voice to my maybe sense of humor and other cultural things that came with my upbringing, perhaps there's some element of Jewish identity, but for the most part, I don't really identify as being Jewish in any way.
Well, I mean, that's the figures show when they did the polling, I can't remember when it was, that it was some ridiculous high number. I think it was in the 80% mark that actually said that atheism amongst Jews is about 83%, I believe, and that it was more of an ethno-identity, ethno-culture, if you will. That's why I'm asking. It's because it's a little confusing to people, I think, what it means to be Jewish, especially if you're atheist. Because I thought, is it a religion or not a religion?
Well, it's also a heritage. So, for someone, let's say, whose grandparents came from Italy, and maybe their family was in Italy for the last 20 generations or so, and they identify as Italian. The thing is, with Jews, I mean, basically, we did identify as a people from a land, from Israel. And 2,000 years ago or so, we were kicked out of Israel by the Romans in 72 AD. And ever since then, we've basically been playing leapfrog, getting, like, whipped from country to country. So, for instance, like, people say, well, you know, Jewish is a religion. You can't say, if someone says, what's your background? And I say, I'm Jewish. They'll say, well, that's a religion. I'm talking about your background. I could say, well, I could tell you where my grandparents are from. The only thing is, if I tell you where their grandparents are from, it's going to be all different countries. And if I tell you where their grandparents are from, it's going to, again, be all different countries. So the one thing that kind of unites us as a people is that we have a common history, that we came from this one place 2,000 years ago and have been bouncing around, but holding on to certain aspects of our value system and other things that go with, I guess, you know, the heritage. Whereas, again, one person might say, oh, I'm Irish. Another might say I'm French. You know, so it's almost like, again, someone said, well, what country are you from? It's like, well, historically, Israel. But personally, I consider myself a New Yorker because I don't identify with Israel. I mean, 2,000 years ago, how close am I to that? You know, probably not much closer than, you know, an Italian guy up the street from me is to Italy, even though his great-grandparents maybe were, you know, from Sicily. So to me, I just consider myself a New Yorker. I mean, really, if someone says, what's your culture? I'm a New Yorker. Other than that, I really wouldn't know what to say.
Well, now, do you when you grew up, did your parents participate in the synagogue and all that stuff you actually go through?
No, not really. Yeah, they were secular Jews. I mean, you know, they said, you're Jewish. And I'd say, well, what does that mean? They're like, I don't ask so many questions. You know, what do you want for dinner? And that was the end of the topic. And we never went to synagogue, and it really
so it sounds more like the host who follows me is Jewish, and he says, yeah, it's more of a business than it is anything.
Okay, I don't know if I'd quite necessarily say that either, but yeah, it's a heritage. It's a common bond by a group of people who came from the same place. And other than that, you know, I am going to be as similar or different from the Jewish guy across the street from me as I am any other culture guy.
All right, stay tuned, folks. We'll be back with our final segment. Take some calls.
Did you see the frightened ones? Did you hear the falling bombs? Did you ever wonder why we had to run for shelter when the promise of a brave new world unfurled beneath the clear blue sky?
Look, Mummy, there's no place.
Chaos theory, hurricane control, advanced privacy, massive ionosphere.
All right, folks, welcome back. Here in the Corporation Nation. My guest today has been Matthew Alper. Just one more question. We'll take some calls here. So, okay, the basis of Israel kind of relies on the concept of Judaism, right? That they are the chosen people, the belief that they are a chosen people. So, for the record, do you believe
that might be part of the mythology, but I don't believe in any mythology.
So you don't believe that the Jewish people are a chosen people?
Well, I'd have to believe in a God who chose them.
No, that's a perfect answer.
No. Being an atheist, I don't believe God chose anyone.
Well, do you think that Jews have the right to be, well, not Jews, but what's going on in Israel right now? Do you believe that there is a justification for what's happening in Palestine, which is the state of Israel and its expansion?
Do I believe there's a justification for what? You mean sort of the semi-occupation and reluctance to grant statehood to Palestinians? Is that what you're asking?
Apartheid, yeah, basically. The taking over of homes and destruction and...
Well, apartheid, you try making a peace accord with a neighbor who, as part of their declaration, is to the destruction of your state. So it's kind of a non sequitur. It's kind of impossible to make peace with a group of people like Hamas, who've basically declared that it's the first inherent part of their charter that they are sworn to the destruction of your country. So imagine we try to sign a peace accord with Canada, where daily rockets are flying into America, into the northern border from Canada, all sanctioned by the government. They don't arrest anyone who fires the missiles because it's part of the government. On top of which Canada says, one day we are determined that we will see the destruction of the United States, but sign this peace contract here and grant us these rights.
You mean the rights that they already had before the illegal state of Israel was created?
All right,
on top of them?
If that's your politics.
Well, it's not my politics. It's the United Nations opinion, actually.
Okay, and you know what? And they have all sorts of opinions. I might not necessarily.
So this requires a belief, apparently, on your part that
it has to do with a historical. No, it has to do with a historical knowledge of basically the history of the modern state of Israel that has been attacked innumerable times by its neighbors, that it's survived by the skin of its teeth each time.
Well, there's only one problem with that.
And that is the right to self-preservation.
Israeli Jewish researchers have come out and said that the DNA evidence isn't there, that Jews there are not from that area. And that was all over the Jewish newspapers.
Yeah, the Jewish newspapers. Okay, listen, whatever propaganda you're trying to sell here, I'm not going to buy into, so you can spout it on a different program. I'm really here to talk about the science of the God part of the brain. But if you want to talk, anti-Israel politics and apartheid stuff, that's your spin on things. All the power to you. But
just establishing a link between the belief in a religious fervor or power and the occupation of a country by a people who believe that they are chosen and who Talmudically believe they are better.
Israelis are 74% atheist. Their government is a secular government. They are not a religious government. There are no government policies that sponsor anything religious. So whoever is running the government of Israel, who is secular and always has been, is not promoting ideas like this is justified because we're the chosen people. This is justified because we have a right, like any other cultural identity on earth, to survive. And when our neighbors swear that they want us dead, we have a right to bear arms.
Well, so there again, if I'm your neighbor, I don't build a house, demolish your house, and build on top of you. But we'll let this go because you don't want to talk about it. Let's take some calls and we'll separate. Let's take Richard from Washington. Richard, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good evening. All that you're talking about, and let's start with science. Science is a method that has no bias. It is as independent of tester-testee interaction as possible.
Correct.
Even though we're allowing the Heisenberg principle. So if you have a belief system and your guest and you yourself always state that you have a belief system, you can't do science because you're already biased. So what we've gone to from the starting out of watching things and observing them and using our own body as the measuring tool, we've gone to instrument to make it completely objective versus subjective, even though Heisenberg principle says there's still some subjectivity in there. So basically, the bias is what causes the problem. The bias allows for the subjective shading of whatever you're discussing or you're trying to analyze. And if you don't deal with that issue, basically everything is just an opinion.
Okay, so your question is... what I'm suggesting in that there might be a God part of the brain, a part of the brain that compels us to have these perceptions. Is it opinion or fact? Is that your question?
Well, no, you've already biased yourself. You already stated there's a God part of the brain. Not just that there's a brain which gives you some objective feedback.
Well, so let's say I state there's a heart. That in the human body there's a heart. Is there bias there?
No. And you can say the same thing. Is there a brain? Yes, there's a brain, but is there a God part in the brain? That's a bias.
Well, Matt, I mean, I'll defend
why is it a bias? I've spent part of the show going over a very brief portion of the scientific data and research suggesting that there are parts of the brain that generate this particular consciousness. So if my whole theory, and you said, well, what's the basis for your theory? I said, oh, it's just my opinion. That'd be
Richard,
one thing.
I'll agree that he actually has very compelling evidence, and if you want to see that evidence, you can buy the book or listen to other interviews. But I agree in the concept, because we all have the flaw, basically, that we believe in some things. We believe something to be true, and when we're vested in that thing, that's the definition of Zionism, actually. And that's exactly what you're showing me, is that Zionism is the support of the state of Israel at any cost. So, the research, though, as far as what you presented today, as the brain being responsible for the chemical reactions, emotions, and things that can be controlled, more power to you. I think it was a wonderful presentation. But of course, people will, as you said,
if you don't agree with what they believe, then you're biased. I'm used to it.
Say again?
I said, if you don't believe what someone else believes in their mind, you are inherently biased.
Well, to be fair, you have been very, very unopen-minded when it comes to the theories you've presented. And
listen, if I were a heart surgeon saying my theory that there is a heart in the human body, and you could say, well, you should be open-minded. Maybe there isn't a heart in the human body, and I'd say no. I'm pretty sure I've done my share of research and data collecting, and there is a heart in the human body. And you can say, well, you're very closed-minded.
I've done years and years of research into what you call conspiracies, and could show you things that would blow your mind, but I have a feeling you already know they exist. The concept that you would invoke the word conspiracy or conspiracy theory, again, lets me know that you are operating within the mainstream. Let me ask you this. When you were in Germany, what kind of script did you write?
It was a social science fiction. It was a dystopic social science fiction. And it was basically about that if humans go on the way they are, then they're heading towards a very unhappy place. So, you think you have some kind of, monopoly on being disenchanted with certain aspects of society, but just because I don't buy into what I would consider conspiracy. Listen, there are people out there who have their own conspiracy theories, and you'd say, that's crazy. I don't believe that.
See, there again, conspiracy theory. There's no theories being put forth. There's patents, there's facts. I didn't put any theories forward. You're just using that, just like you would say that I would be anti-Semitic, even though Semitic doesn't even mean Jew. So, I find that there's something to be questioned here. Thanks for joining me, sir. Good luck to you. Join me tomorrow for Daniel. Take care.